Victory in Europe, Victory Day in London. For 5 years, Churchill has stood at the helm, breasting the storms of disaster and riding the tide of victory from El Alamein to Normandy to the German surrender. The war was won. But the people who cheered him as he stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace would turn to another man to lead them into peace. They had the power to elect their leaders, but no one could silence a Winston Churchill. His prophetic voice would still be heard in the world. Germany was defeated, but the Allies still had to deal with Japan. There were also many problems connected with the resettlement of Europe which had to be resolved. While the Allied leaders met at Potsdam, Britain held a general election, the first since 1935. Although the Conservatives had held large majorities in the House of Commons since 1931, Churchill's wartime government had been a coalition of all parties. The leaders of the Labour Party held important posts in the cabinet. Churchill's deputy prime minister was the Labour leader Clement Attlee. Many voters thought that in supporting Churchill's wartime colleagues, they were voting for Churchill himself. But the polls gave Attlee a clear victory over the Conservatives. Churchill was defeated. It was a bitter moment, perhaps the most bitter of his career. I awoke with a sudden sharp stab of almost physical pain, he wrote. A hitherto unconscious conviction that we were beaten broke forth and dominated my mind. I should fall. The power to shape the future would be denied me. Though out of office, Churchill still had a role to play, as Drew Middleton of the New York Times explains.
The leadership of the opposition was obviously far too limited a field for Churchill. He knew he had, and he used his tremendous influence in the United States and in Europe for three purposes. The first was to alert the Western world to what he saw as the dangers imposed by the Soviet bloc. The second was to retain at all costs the Anglo-American solidarity he had built up during the war. And thirdly, to goad, cajole, and push Europe into the unity which he regarded as indispensable to her freedom.
To get the taste of defeat out of his mouth, Churchill came to stay with American friends in Florida. The sudden release from high office seemed to age him, as though the strain of the previous 5 years had all at once caught up with him.
Been asked to say just 10 words, but I haven't been told which 10 words they should be. But there are 10 words which, or thereabouts 10, which come very readily to my mind, and that is the great pleasure I have in feeling the genial sunshine of Miami Beach. The great pleasure I have in feeling the genial sunshine of Miami Beach. One too many.
While in America, Churchill paid a visit to Roosevelt's grave in New York State. It was a private tribute to the friend and colleague in the Grand Alliance which had brought peace to the world. Roosevelt had died in April 1945, soon after returning from Yalta. Churchill was to survive him for 20 years. Though other men now wielded the power that so recently was his, Churchill was free to speak out on matters where his name and enormous prestige carried great weight. At Fulton's Westminster College in President Truman's own state of Missouri, he used a phrase which instantly became part of the language of the free world.
Indeed, now that I come to think of it, it was at Westminster that I received a very large part of my education in politics, dialectics, rhetoric, and one or two other things. Neither the sure prevention of war nor the continuous rise of world organization will be gained without what I have called the fraternal association of the English-speaking people.
As he often did, Churchill asked for the television lights to be turned off.
This means a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and Empire and the United States of America. Ladies and gentlemen, this is no time for generalities, and I will venture to be precise. A shadow had fallen upon the scenes so lately lighted by the Allied victory. Nobody knows what Soviet Russia and its Communist International Organization intends to do in the immediate future. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. I do not believe that Soviet Russia desires war. What I have seen of our Russian friends and allies during the war, I am convinced that there is nothing they admire so much as strength, and there is nothing for which they have less respect than for weakness, especially military weakness. If we adhere faithfully to the Charter of the United Nations and walk forward in sedate and sober strength, seeking no one's land or treasure, seeking to lay no arbitrary control upon the thoughts of men, if all British moral and material forces and convictions are joined with your own in fraternal association, the high roads of the future will be clear, not only for us, but for all, not only for our time, but for a century to come.
Soviet sympathizers protested. Churchill's forthright language disturbed the Kremlin. The communists feared the power of his words and his influence in the Western democracies. But Churchill had dealt with Stalin face to face. He had seen small nations fall under the heel of one oppressor, and now he saw it happening again. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, he made sure his message got through.
I have no technical and no university education, and have just had to pick up a few things as I went along. Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot speak to you here tonight without expressing to the United States, as I have perhaps some right to do, the thanks of Britain and of Europe for the splendid part America is playing in the world. Many nations have risen to the summit of human affairs, but here is a great example where new won supremacy has not been used for self-aggrandizement, but only for further sacrifice. We are now confronted with something quite as wicked, but in some ways more formidable than Hitler. Because Hitler had only the Herrenfolk pride and anti-Semitic hatred to exploit. He had no fundamental theme. But these 13 men in the Kremlin have their hierarchy and a church of communist adepts whose missionaries are in every country as a fifth column. Obscure people, about awaiting the day when they hope to be the absolute masters of their fellow countrymen. and pay off old scores. They have their anti-God religion and their communist doctrine of the entire subjugation of the individual to the state, and behind this stands the largest army in the world, in the hands of a government pursuing imperialist expansion as no Tsar or Kaiser has ever done. I must not conceal from you tonight the truth as I see it. It is certain that Europe would have been communized like Czechoslovakia and London under bombardment some time ago, but for the deterrent of the atomic bomb in the hands of the United States.
Churchill was born a year before Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. At the age of 73, he saw India proclaimed independent and divided into two sovereign states by the last British Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten.
He fought the India Bill tooth and nail in '47, largely, I suppose, because of his own experience as a young man in India. I think until the end of his life, he looked on India as the India of the 1890s. Never understood the changes there. Couldn't understand how a man like Gandhi or Nehru, even though they'd gone to the same school, could be responsible for India.
The British Raj was gone. A new world was in being. Few men of Churchill's generation could understand the changes that had taken place. Britain was still a great nation, but she could never again be the power in the world she had once been. How did Churchill see the future?
The unity of Europe was one of the prizes he sought. He was a little vague about how he would go about it. Most people were at that time. But he welcomed every step towards it. Ironically, he welcomed the rise to economic power of the German Federal Republic. He cheered when the iron and steel community was formed because he saw it as it became a step towards the formation of the European common market. At the same time, he was increasingly worried by the weakness of France, her political and economic weakness, and by the continued turbulence in Italy. And finally, of course, he realized that the ebb in Britain's power had deprived her of her old influence in Europe, for good or ill.
Churchill collected many international awards, among them the Nobel Prize for Literature and the Charlemagne Prize for his work for Europe. He was a prophet accorded much honor outside his own country, although inside Britain many still suspected him of being a warmonger.
It is not a movement of parties, but a movement of peoples. It must be all for all. Europe can only be united by the heartfelt wish and vehement expression of the great majority of all the peoples, in all the parties, in all the freedom-loving countries, no matter where they dwell or how they vote. We cannot aim at anything less than the union of Europe as a whole, and we look forward with confidence to the day when that union will be achieved.
At Strasbourg, he sounded another warning note.
Prenez garde. Je vais parler français. Ce n'est pas contre une race, ce n'est pas contre une nation quelconque que nous nous rassemblons. C'est contre la tyrannie.
To fight tyranny. That, Churchill said, was the motive for Western Europe's coming together in the Council of Nations. In the 5 years following the election of 1945, great changes took place in British society as a result of socialist policies. As leader of the opposition, Churchill attacked these policies. But the Conservative Party had to move with the times if they were to regain power. Churchill had able men to back him up, but his own eloquence was one of their principal weapons.
at least we have one first-class intelligence now brooding upon our affairs. But I must make it clear that we, conservatives, do not believe that there is a quack cure-all for the troubles and tribulations of human life. We are quite sure that the nationalization of our industries will not make them profitable to the country or satisfactory for their workers. The scheme of society for which we stand is the establishment and maintenance of a basic minimum standard of life and labor, below which a man or woman of goodwill, however old or weak, shall not be allowed to fall.
He was fairly irresponsible in some of his attacks on labor policy. I mean, the Labor government had been elected to carry out a program, it was doing it. I don't think it was so much Winston's lack of understanding of what Britain wanted, but just that combativeness in him that made him fight anything the other people had put forward. He did also say, though, that it wasn't the ideas he was against, but the administration. Well, of course they were badly administered at first. Any big program is. But Winston took these things, these criticisms, to try and demolish the whole structure.
Why, in the same way, should it be suggested that we in this island cannot have at least as good a life all round as we had before the war, and the means of making constant progressive improvement upon it? Do not therefore believe these fantastic tales that the modern world with all its science is broke and ruined. Crazy doctrines, clumsy fingers, meddlesome matties, vicious and morbid trends of policy, these are what are manufacturing shortages and miseries by their vice and folly. We propose, if and when we have the power, to set the people free as quickly as possible from the controls and restrictions which now beset their daily life.
Set the people free. The phrase was an election winner. In 1951, the voters grasped the opportunity to escape from the drabness of post-war life. After 6 years of austerity, they had had enough of socialist government. Attlee was out. The 77-year-old Winston Churchill brought the promise of better things, and he was back once more as Prime Minister.
Churchill carried out almost all his campaign promises. He set the people free, rationing was done away with, industry was revitalized, there was a brief but quite real period of prosperity in England in the 50s. At the same time, he maintained the same policies in foreign affairs that he had in opposition. By frequent visits, he maintained his influence over successive American administrations. At the same time, he did everything he could to push the idea of European unity further and further toward reality. But he was always conscious, deeply conscious, that Britain's power and influence was not what it had been.
Churchill remained Prime Minister for 4 years. When George VI died, he saw the Princess Elisabeth crowned Queen and accepted from her a knighthood in the Order of the Garter. Anthony Eden, his faithful lieutenant, succeeded him. On his retirement, Churchill could have had any title he wanted, even a dukedom like his illustrious ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough, but he chose to remain a commoner.
Well, this was the greatest man I've ever met. He was bold and brave in war, both as a soldier and as a politician. He was magnanimous in peace, far-sighted. He saw the world in black and whites with great historical perspective. He was bullheaded, certainly. He talked too much often. He sometimes grasped at straws. He often was too conscious of the past and failed to come to grips with the present. But having said all this, he was a great Democrat, a child of the House of Commons, as he described himself. Given great power, he never sought to use it for base or ignoble ends. This was a very great man and a gentleman.
Churchill lived on quietly at Chartwell, his country home, until 1965, when he died soon after his 90th birthday. In one way or another, he had served 6 monarchs, but he always recognized that power came from the people and rested in the House of Commons.
Sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union strong and great. Humanity, with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate.